We want to thank Dale. I think she chaired this situation here, and she did a great job. We want to thank her better half, Mike and Tim, for carving the meat and everything and helping out. And then along with Dale, her mother-in-law Dot, and Susie McDaniel, Raquel Flonico, and Ann Dupree, Diane Kilson, Jeanette Albert, Trudy Felsman, JW, and Trish, and Mrs. Overman, and Patty, that's it. Oh well, I'm trying. Kathy Roberts hiding in the kitchen. Anybody else hiding back there with you guys? Did I miss anybody? Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Pleasure. Each year I have an opportunity to go to about 15 or 20 different groups put on a historical program. But it's always nice to be at home and with people I know, and I think virtually every one of you know who I am. And if I don't know you, well, I'm sure you'll find out who I am before the end of the evening. Now, tonight I'm putting together a program that's basically not really very well organized. I hope you bear with me if it isn't, we'll say, sort of in a regular sequence, because I pulled out slides and pictures of Fairhaven and the Fairhaven area that pertain to the fire department of Fairhaven and its history and the people who were involved with it. And I think after you see about a dozen of the slides, you'll sort of see how it's falling together. And if I can answer questions afterwards, I'll be very happy to. But if you see something that you just have to ask a question about during the program, I'm sure if your question is short, I'll try to answer it. And or if you want to make a comment about something, or if I say something incorrectly, if I don't describe something in the right way, please, feel free to speak out. As a matter of fact, they tell you when you start a program, you should start with a joke. Well, I'll tell you a joke about a couple who were a perfect match. She was a redhead and he was a stick. Get her? A wooden match, a redhead and a stick. Well, that's a joke from 1895. Now that most of your matches are paper nowadays, I guess it's irrelevant. No wonder I didn't get any laughs. So I better stick to history instead of being a comedian. Now, okay, now can everybody see the screen? Yeah. All right. Now, I'm just showing you what Fairhaven basically was like around the turn of the century. And this was the McGregor House on River Lawn, just west of where the Rice houses are today. And this house replaced an earlier house which burned to the ground because there was not adequate fire protection. And that was around 1900 that the house burned, and this house replaced it. Fairhaven also had farms, and of course a farm, even though it looks innocent and peaceful, also was another potential fire hazard. Brookside Farm was up on Fairhaven Road to Ridge, and included most of the property that's now Fairhaven Fields. And a Dr. Dixon, who was a veterinary doctor, operated it around the 1900s, 1910 period. Previous to that, as a matter of fact, the farmhouse, which is still occupied by Mr. and Mrs. de la Perouse, that farmhouse had sheltered some 16 people in the blizzard of 1888, and those people were there for 5 days. And also, part of Fairhaven in the early 1900s would include an area that was created as East Side Park, and that would be in the western section of Fairhaven along River Road, streets that are now Lincoln and Lexington, 1st and 2nd Street. And this is Chester Menton with his goat, Billy, B-I-L-L-I-E, and that's supposed to be a fire wagon that he has. And the house in the background is still standing at the corner of 1st and Lexington. It's where Derry Bennett and his wife Barbara live today. So Fairhaven had a lot of houses, large mansions, estates, farms, and ordinary houses, in addition to the historic houses in the historic district. Now, this is the eel pot, and the eel pot was one of the businesses of Fairhaven. It was a tobacco factory where about 8 men were employed to roll cigars from leaf tobacco, and tobacco supplies, including cigarettes and snuff, pipe tobacco, were sold there. And a man named Edmund Wilbur operated this store for many years, and as a matter of fact, it was one of the last businesses of its type in New Jersey where cigars were actually made by hand. Now, the reason I show you this building, which was located where the corner restaurant is now on Fairhaven Road and River Road, is that in 1895 this building took fire, and a bucket brigade of citizens, fortunately, were able to put out the fire without it doing too much damage to the building. And this is how the building looked maybe around 1910 or so. Now, the building was later moved east on River Road, and it's now a Cardi's beauty salon. Now, one of the people who was very instrumental in the formation of the fire company was Edward Wise, who was a lawyer in Red Bank, and here he is with his wife, who was Bessie Stinson. Bessie Stinson was from a family of vaudevillians. Her parents summered in Fairhaven for a number of years, and I guess that's how, from living in the area, that Ed Wise met her. And he was the lawyer who drew up the charter for the Fairhaven Volunteer Fire Company. And they later lived on Pinckney Road in Red Bank, and this is a picture of them getting into a carriage at 66 Pinckney Road. Now, another person who helped form the fire company was Henry Schneider, and he was a young man who was involved in the grocery and general store business with George Hendrickson. And in 1912, when Fairhaven became a borough, Henry Schneider was appointed the overseer of the poor. And at that time, he reluctantly took the job because I guess it wasn't very popular, and he only intended to keep the job for about a year or so. Now, another person who incorporated the fire company, or helped incorporate in 1904, was Christopher Doughty Chandler. And here we see him as an older man in his garden. And of course, he was a nurseryman originally. He had a very early nursery and plant business in Fairhaven in the 1880s. He then became Fairhaven's postmaster around 1901, and he was that for about 20 years. He also operated a little store on the corner of Fairhaven Road and River Road, which is now the rear of Fairhaven Hardware, the little wooden building in the back, but originally that was out on the corner. And he sold stationery supplies, and also he was a photographer. He was Fairhaven's first photographer, and many of the pictures you see here tonight were originally taken by C.D. Chandler. And by the way, his grandfather was the man named Jeremiah Chandler, who was recorded as building the first house that people had any sort of knowledge of, or any record of it being built, in Fairhaven in 1816. Now, the fire company was organized in 1904, and immediately they set to work to build a firehouse at what is now 120 Fairhaven Road, or Dr. Moran's building, as most people know it. Now, leaving aside the fire wagon in the front for a moment, because we'll come to that later, the firemen built this building mostly with their own labor, and they contracted out some other work. George J. Hendrickson, the man who owned the general store and also was the owner of this property, he either sold or somehow worked out an arrangement where he let the fire company have this property of his for their firehouse. Now, one skipped here a minute. All right, one of the first things they went about doing was to raise money. And as far as I could find, the first fundraiser they had was a show that was put on in the old Red Bank Opera House, which was up at West Front Street, in the building just east of the Rex Diner. I mean, everybody knows where the Rex Diner was. Well, in the building just east of that, that was built as Red Bank's Opera House for about 22 years or so. It was the only theatrical building in Red Bank. Well, these vaudevillians who came here for the summer, I guess were in the same sort of a predicament that the people who make Northern Exposure are in. They were doing filming out in Rosslyn, Washington, and here you have people, movie people, TV people, you have that elk walking down Main Street. Naturally, the townspeople were resentful and skeptical of these people, especially if they're riding in Porsches and Lamborghinis and Maseratis and other cars that you can't even pronounce the names. So the way that those people, putting on Northern Exposure, got friendly with the townspeople was by buying a very good restored used fire truck for the Rosslyn Fire Department. And I think the truck was valued at over $100,000. Well, the vaudevillians in Fairhaven at first were viewed with skepticism also by the natives. And the reason, I guess, was because they were sort of bohemian people. They sort of kept to themselves, and their lifestyle was sort of low-key, that they would wear shabby clothes going shopping where everybody else would dress up. Our so-called decent people would dress up. Well, anyway, they decided the way to get accepted by the natives was to get involved in what was going on. And the creation of a fire company was one such, avenue for them to get involved in. So they put on a benefit at the Red Bank Opera House, and the people who put on the benefit included Annie Hard, who for 50 years was a resident of Fairhaven. She was perhaps the best known of the local vaudevillians. She originally was from Massachusetts. At one time she was making $800 a week in the 1880s and 1890s by performing at Tony Pastor's in New York. When she died in retirement at the Atlantic Hotel in 1947, she was only living on $15 a week from the Actors Fund. So she was one of the people who put on this show in June of 1905. Albert Stinson was another person, and he and his wife, Clara Merton, put on eccentric sketches where he was like the hen-picked husband and she was, pardon expression, the bitchy wife or shrewy wife. I guess they were sort of like the Alan Peg Bundy of their time. And also Bobby Nord, who is the man who is with the mustache, let's see, here, third from the right. Bobby Nord also was one of the actors who appeared in this program in 1905. This is shown on Broadway years later from a play called The Pleasure Seekers. And, of course, Hap Handy. Andrew Handy was known as Hap Handy. He lived on Willow Street. I guess 89 Willow Street is the address of the house. He and his wife would perform as Hap Handy and Diana. She danced through bubbles, much like the champagne bubbles of Lawrence Welk. And he was the one who operated the bubble machine and also electric lights. And here he is with a goat cart. Now, this was the program that concluded. They had a number of programs, a number of acts, including Annie Hart, but they concluded with Way Down East, Way Up East. And it was sort of a takeoff on Way Down East. And James Tenbrook, Charles Nelson, Bobby Nort, Ed Begley, who we believe may have been a grandfather of the present Ed Begley Jr. Also, you will see that Hap Handy and Albert Stinson, James Mack, who was one of the three Mack brothers, and was an uncle of Leonard Mack, and Frank Martineau, who was a very, adept stage manager, and also was a very dedicated member of your fire company, and Lambert. Mr. Lambert was the music director. So these were the people who put on this program on June 21st, 1905 at the Red Bank Opera House. Well, tragically, the next 3 nights at Red Bank Opera House was to be this Boston Ideal Opera Company. And they were going to have a different play or a different skit every night. And sad to say, they only got through 2 nights. When on Saturday morning, don't forget the fire company's benefit was Wednesday night. Saturday morning, in the early hours of the morning, the Opera House took fire and was completely destroyed. It was a mass of flames that all the firemen from Red Bank could do was to save adjoining properties. As a matter of fact, a mattress in the Central Hotel, which was, well, most of us know it as the place where Wicker Rose has been, a mattress on the top floor of the Central Hotel even burst into flames, I guess due to spontaneous combustion. So the Opera House was never rebuilt. Now, I mentioned Frank Martineau, and this is Frank Martineau on the right in this picture, which you have the complete picture, I guess, downstairs. And George J. Hendrickson is George Woodward is the man in the middle. He was a chief. And also, the man on the left is George Walters, who was another vaudevillian. He was from the group known as Walters, Wesson, and Walters. And a sister of his was the father of Charlie Wesson. And most of you, some of you old-timers remember Charlie Wesson. And by the way, I should go back to that in a minute. In the background, and again, it's a very poor picture, but it shows one of the two hose carts that were pulled by the firemen. These were the reels that the hose would be rolled on. And one of those hose carts, which was bought in 1905, was their first major piece of equipment. They responded to the very first fire with that hose cart. And the following year, they came up with this Holloway hook and ladder wagon and chemical engine. It not only was a hook and ladder wagon, but underneath were these two large cylinders which, when inverted, acted like fire extinguishers and would put out a pretty sizable blaze. Now, I'll explain more about this particular picture in a few minutes, but anyway, basically this wagon was bought in 1906 and it served the fire company until about 1920. It was then, the body of it was then later put on a Brockway chassis, and I believe used till about 1937. Now, one of the first fires, or the first fire that wagon that you just saw responded to, was down at the Hutchinson House on Rumson Road, which was just immediately west of where Mercer's property is. And most of you know the Mercer property where the tapered hedge and the flowers are planted. Well, Thomas McCarter was building his house on Rumson Hill, and he was renting the Hutchinson House, and that house had a chimney fire. And Fairhaven was called to put out the fire, as well as the two fire companies in Rumson, one of which was just brand new, the Rumson Fire Department. The Rumson Fire Company, which is now down on River Road, next to Briodes, was just brand new at that time. They were on Center Street, of course. But anyway, the Fairhaven Fire Company was the first people to get there. They put out the fire in no time with that chemical engine, but just using the chemicals. And Thomas McCarter rewarded them by giving them a trumpet, one of these horns, which I believe is in the case. Now, we haven't been able to determine which one it was. And Thomas McCarter had been an Attorney General of New Jersey. He helped settle a strike with the trolley workers in Newark in 1903. And he realized that the trolley business and also the electric business, electric generation, needed supervision. So he quit his job as Attorney General and turned it over to his brother, as a matter of fact, his brother Robert, and he founded Public Service, which was the forerunner of both PSE&G and also New Jersey Transit. And he owned a lot of property in Fairhaven, besides having this large estate in Rumson. His property actually extended down into Fairhaven. And of course, I saw Mr. McCarter in person once when he was quite elderly, and he was the sort of man that you either loved him or you hated him. Now, getting back to the Fairhaven Fire Company, they entered an event in Red Bank. There was, I guess, the Red Bank Carnival. They ordered their white uniforms, and this was the first time their white uniforms were worn. And here they are coming by the Throckmorton Gully in Red Bank, where the Lutheran Church, of course, is today on what would be to your right, and Hubbard Park would be to your left. And here we see the men pulling the hose cart, and those are the men who are on the ground. And of course, bringing up the rear is the Fairhaven hook and ladder wagon. And this is the wagon in that same parade. And a man named Dennis Lefferson from Little Silver supplied this team of horses. He's the heavyset man on the left. And Alfred Hendrickson, who was usually the driver of the wagon when it would be brought to a fire, he's sitting on the right. And he sometimes, of course, was, the driver would take the wagon in a parade as well. It depended where Mr. Lefferson was available or not. And of course, I believe they won a prize for their appearance because naturally their white uniforms were spotless. Now, here's a close-up of children admiring that parade, and of course, again, these white horses, I guess we should have had color pictures back then, but they probably were very beautiful. Now, this is the Atlantic Hotel, and of course, across the street you'll see the Firehouse, and of course you'll see a rim, which was the rim of a locomotive. And again, it doesn't show up too well in that picture, but that's about the best picture I had. That rim would be hit with a hammer, and that was the fire alarm up to about 1907. Now, the reason I show this picture of the Atlantic Hotel, in 1907, in March, a very tragic fire occurred to the Atlantic Hotel stables. Fortunately, there was no loss of human life, but 7 horses, including some trotters, were burned to death in the fire, and obviously the stable became an inferno of flames. The doors had been locked. Afterwards, there were laws made to prevent the locking of livestock in buildings. That today, I believe, it's still against the law to lock horses or other large animals, except dangerous animals, we'll say like lions or tigers. It's against the law to lock animals in a building. Now, this getting back again to the Firehouse, here's the gong on the left. It was hung on this, we'll say, stand, and it would be rung when there would be fire. And by the way, under the wagon, you see these 2 tanks in the middle. Those were the 2 chemical tanks that would be inverted and used as a fire extinguisher for a pretty good sized fire. Or they would accommodate a fire that was up to a pretty good size.
Excuse me, I got a question.
Sure.
You said on the horses that pulled the wagon, they were Mr. Hendrickson's, I believe you said?
No, Mr. Lefferson, he
Okay.
had the special ones that were white. They would take to a parade. But when a fire alarm came in, whoever came with the first team, they would
Okay,
use
yeah.
those. They didn't care whether the horse
Okay,
is black or
okay.
blue.
First one.
That's right. Yeah, and we'll come to that in a minute. They used, sometimes they were paid $5, and sometimes they weren't. It depended, I guess, if the money was in the treasury or not. And some people, like townspeople, like somebody like the Hendrickson, would not accept money. Or I guess the Mulvihills wouldn't either. Because, like Jack Mulvihill's granduncle, he had the stagecoach route, and also he did the street Who's this?
Riley, John Riley.
Well, that could be. So anyway, in 1907 they bought this bell, which was used, and this was going to be the fire alarm or the fire bell, and I believe they bought it from Bayonne. And this is the bell as it was before it was raised onto its tower. And a gentleman whom I did not really know very well because I was very young when he died, but a man named Charles Hobro, who was a windmill plumber, and he was a brother of John Hobro, who was quite an active fireman, who lived down on Fairhaven Road. Charles Hobro had the contract for putting up the tower. And now some of these people, the boy on the left, the young man I should say, with the cap and his hands on his waist, he's one of the Kirchens. And also, the other man in the background next to him, second from left, is one of the Hendricksons. We have a dispute about some of the other people, and we believe the man with the officer's cap on the right is a Minton. Now again, I would have to look up. I have some different notes. Some of those are in dispute. Different people say they're different, that the people shown are different. And it's hard to get everybody to agree on it. But this is basically behind the firehouse before the bell was raised. Now this is the raising of the bell. You'll notice the bell is still on the ground. And the tower, of course, is basically uncompleted. But those people who you just saw in the picture a minute ago are up on the tower in different poses. And of course that's the firehouse immediately in front of the tower and the Atlantic Hotel in the background. And the building on the left was the old American Mechanics Hall, which later would become Fairhaven's Borough Hall. And slowly but surely the bell inched its way upward. It was pulled up. There you see it about halfway up. And by the way, in the background, the little building, two-story building on the left, was the general store. And we'll see more about that in a minute. And here's the bell a little bit higher. And apparently that was quite a ceremony. And like I said, that occurred back in 1907. Now, in 1908, the Mount Carriage factory on Maple Avenue and West Front Street in Red Bank took fire, and the Red Bank fire departments, actually back then, and again I don't want to confuse you, but there were 5 fire departments in Red Bank, and the West Side Fire Department, which is now part of Red Bank, was part of Shrewsbury Township at that time. Now don't ask me why, but I'm just going by their records. Well, anyway, the Red Bank Fire Department asked for assistance from Fairhaven, and Fairhaven came and assisted in the putting out of this fire. Of course, basically the carriage factory was ruined, or most all of it was ruined, and eventually was rebuilt on a smaller scale. But that was the first instance I could find of where Fairhaven was asked to go to Red Bank to help out. Now, the next year, again another unusual fire, and the section in Grange Avenue and Hants Road by the river, and what had been East Side Park. And you must remember there was no borough of Fairhaven at this time. All of Fairhaven, Rumson and Red Bank, up to 1908, well, Rumson became a borough in 1907, Red Bank in 1908. But Fairhaven basically was just part of Shrewsbury Township, and you really didn't know who had jurisdiction over what. So this Denhard mansion, was now 92 Grange Avenue, was set on fire by an arsonist. And this man, who later was apprehended, had broken into the house to steal jewelry or silverware, whatever he could find of value. It was in March of the year because the house was closed. It was just used as a summer house. And after he had taken his loot, he set fire to the house. And of course, apparently the fire had quite a headway, that by the time firemen were called from Red Bank, because frequently Red Bank firemen responded to fires at East Side Park. Also, Fairhaven was called to help out, but the fire consumed the house. It was driven by a wind, and all that was left was the chimney. Now, on a happier note, this is a parade in Freehold, and I believe you have a picture of this right in your trophy case, and I'm going to show you a few enlargements of it. This was on Main Street in Freehold around 1912. Here we see the firemen again with the hose cart in the lead. And this is a sort of a close-up of the leaders. And the wagon, of course, brought up the rear. And I don't know if they won a prize for their appearance in that parade, but I'm sure they impressed a lot of people. Then later on that year, in September of 1912, down in Asbury Park, here is the wagon, and Alfred Hendrickson is the driver, and that's John Mulvihill Sr., Jack's grandfather, who's walking alongside. And I think we have close-ups of them. Yes, this is Alfred Hendrickson at the reins. And John Mulvihill Sr. Now, as somebody just mentioned a few minutes ago about the teams of horses, when a fire bell would ring, the first person with an available team would try to get there to the firehouse to hitch up to the wagon. And the Hendricksons at that time were involved in being moving men. And here we see Alfred Hendrickson with his moving wagon on River Road, about outside 675 River Road or thereabouts. You see the trolley tracks with the brick in the middle. And sometimes his team, no doubt, was used to pull the fire wagon. Now, after Fairhaven became a borough in 1912, the firehouse was used as an election center. And here we see Frank Colbert, the man who's standing second from right. He was Fairhaven's first mayor. He's standing in the background. Of course, the fire wagon is behind him. But you see the harnesses in the ceiling. And those harnesses, the harnesses would be dropped down from the ceiling when the fire alarm would be rung and a team brought in. And the harnesses were arranged so they could easily be dropped down and hitched up to the team, and then the team hitched to the wagon. And by the way, the young man who is at the left of the table, let me see and get a pointer on him, he's one of the Kirchens. Now, as time progressed, here are two other men who were involved with the fire company. William Kirchen, who was nicknamed Squire Kirchen, he was Fairhaven's barber and also Justice of the Peace. He is the man with the black coat on the left. And he was the father of the various brothers. I guess there must have been 5 or 6 Kirchen brothers. And George J. Hendrickson, the man who ran the general store for so many years and also whose property, upon whose property the Firehouse was built. Here they are outside the general store just prior to its demise. And it's springtime because there are packages of flower seed and vegetable seed in the window. And of course the cattle on the porch very likely was the pet of the general store. Well, unfortunately, on Washington's birthday night in 1918, the store took fire and burned to the ground. And unfortunately, I guess because of the flammable nature of things, they carried everything from gasoline and kerosene to notions and food, a little bit of everything. And here we see Charles Pitt Wortley, who was Fairhaven's first police chief. He had that post when Fairhaven became a borough in 1912, and he served until 1919. And here he is standing guard outside the ruins. Now, Mr. Wortley also was involved with the fire company, and as a matter of fact, he became a police officer, I guess at the age of 65 or 66, when most people would want to retire. He had been in the Civil War as a young man in both the Army and then later the Navy. He had been at the Battle of Bull Run, and he also was at the Battle of Mobile Bay in the Navy. And he came to live in Fairhaven after the war. He did numerous things. He was a house painter, he was a gardener, he was sort of a jack of all trades. And then he became a town constable, and then, of course, eventually the town's police officer or chief of police. And it was said that he kept law and order almost every day of the year, except on Halloween night when the young people of the town got too much for him. And of course, things got out of control. Well, it's right around that time that we were in World War I. And after the war was over, the veterans who had served from Fairhaven came back, and there was a parade in Fairhaven. And Ralph Smith, who had been a vaudevillian and who served in the Spanish-American as well as World War I, was its Grand Marshal. And the only person I can really identify in this picture is the young man with the sailor's outfit right here in the front, who's Bucky Little. He's the young boy with the necktie and the sailor's outfit. And this is looking towards the corner of Fairhaven Road. You'll see the old American Mechanics Hall in the background over here, and the little store, which really was on the corner, C.D. Chandler's store, plus Bennett's Monmouth Hotel beyond that, where Chemical Bank is today. Now, with so many things becoming motorized, that by 1920, even the Iceman had some sort of an automobile or had a truck. So the firemen had less and less people to depend on coming along with a team of horses. So they decided they would get a fire truck. And what they bought was a Robinson Monarch. And here it is here in a parade in Red Bank in 1922. And Leroy King, who was one of its early drivers, is the man who's driving. And of course, most of you, if you're as old as me, you certainly remember Roy King, because he was also the driver of the garbage truck. And by the way, the vehicle after the truck was one of the very early Borough Bus Company buses. And in that same parade, here's the fire truck, turning from Shrewsbury Avenue onto one of those side streets, either Herbert Street or Catherine Street. I'm not just sure which one it is, but this is the fire truck turning to go down that street after the parade was over. This truck served Fairhaven very well, and I believe it was sold in 1936 to Herbertsville in Bricktown, and they used the truck for a number of years. Now, the truck, I should mention that the chemical tanks were taken off of the horse-drawn wagon and put on this truck. And here in 1923 or thereabouts, here we see Joseph Herden, who by that time was Fairhaven's police officer or police chief. He was just like Pitt Wortley, he was a one-man police department. And besides his duties as a policeman, he also had to take care of the fire truck. And also, at this time, in 1923, they bought a Brockway chassis for the old hook and ladder wagon. And so they eventually had two pieces of equipment. And here's a close-up of Joseph Herden. And I understand from some old-timers who remember him that his outfit was beige or khaki rather than blue. Or at least at that time, in the 20s. Now, another person who comes on the scene and who is a vaudevillian as well as being a working steeplejack was a man known as Steeplejack Adams. And Steeplejack Adams would amaze people at the various carnivals that were put on and at the early firemen's fairs in Fairhaven. He would go up on that fire tower that you just saw a few minutes ago, and one of his acts was he would hang upside down and drink a glass of water without spilling it. That's drinking a glass of water upside down without spilling it. And also, he would also go up handcuffed and smoke a cigarette while hanging upside down. And also in vaudeville, he had a snake act. Now, I don't know that he took the snakes up on the tower with him, but maybe he should have. And he and George Moxley were in business as steeplejacks, and they also did roof and chimney repair. Now, I show you the steamer Keansburg because right over here behind us we have a picture of the group that went in 1923 to Coney Island to a fireman's outing or a fireman's convention. And they chartered the steamer Keansburg, which was the original boat that the Keansburg Steamboat Company had. The boat had been built in 1878 as the steamer Nantasket up at Nantasket Beach in Massachusetts, and was bought in 1910 and renamed the Keansburg. Well, in coming back from Coney Island in 1923, the boat ran aground off Highlands, and most of the people had to be rescued and taken off by smaller boats. And I'm sure some of you who are old-timers probably remember older people in the fire company telling you about this incident with the steamer Keansburg. Now, let me just go back to this one. This is the Veterans Monument. Again, I don't know why it, let me just try to get it to fall in place. Sometimes they warp with the heat. Now it's getting worse. Let's go back. Okay. Okay, well, go back to it again. Okay. The Veterans Monument was dedicated in August of 1924, and different floral wreaths were laid in that ceremony. I believe it was August 16, 1924. And one of the wreaths that was laid represented the Fairhaven Fire Company, and it was Harry Curtis, who was a fireman and who also was very influential in the fire department at that time, and also for years later, who was one of the people who put the wreath down representing the fire department. Besides the fire department, also the Gold Star Mothers, there was one Gold Star Mother represented, and also the vaudevillians put wreaths, and also the Memorial Park Committee put a wreath down. Now I'm just trying to come back to another one here. Just bear with me a minute till I take this out, and I just want to try to get this slide in place. No, all right. This one didn't want to go in place, but most of you know where Fanny Farmer's Candy is in Red Bank today. And the building that is now Fanny Farm originally was 2 stories high. And the reason I was going to show that, or try to show that, is that in 1927, when that building took fire, Fairhaven was called on for assistance to pump out the Red Bank Register building, which was next door, so their presses, which were in the basement, would not be flooded. And as a matter of fact, I guess more water had been put on the fire trying to put out that building, and of course it's a relatively small building. And up to that time, that was the most gallonage, I guess, of water, if you want to use that term, that had been used in Red Bank's history. Now, perhaps in some more recent fires, they've used more water than that. But that also was another out-of-town fire that the Fairhaven Fire Department was very commendable for their help, and also the fact that they saved the Register's press. Now, in 1929, there was a sanitation department created in Fairhaven, and this was the first time there was actual collection of garbage, or there actually was a sanitation department. And the 2 men who ran the department were Thomas Simmons and Leroy King. And Leroy King, of course, they're shown here as older men, but he was the same man that you saw a few moments ago as the driver of the fire truck. And usually Leroy King drove the garbage truck. They had just one garbage truck, and Thomas Simmons walked along after it, and he was the man who would put the garbage inside. And as a matter of fact, when I was 2 years old, my mother and I had the thrill of having a ride in the garbage truck with Mr. King and Emmons. And we rode the front, of course, not the back. And also another man who was very instrumental with the fire department, and a man who several people have been called Mr. Fairhaven over the years, and this was Oscar Becker Sr. Now, most of you knew Oscar Becker Jr., but this is his father, and if you remember the father, then you have to be as old as me, or perhaps older. And this man became the street superintendent in 1933. He had his own contracting business besides, and he also was the fire chief, I believe, in 1936, or thereabouts. And this man, at one time, knew everybody in Fairhaven. He had at least spoken to everybody once, and he was a very wonderful person. Now, this is his wife, I believe, on the right, Mrs. Becker. I remember her quite well, but I hope I'm identifying her correctly. And Mrs. Sickles is the woman on the left. And this, I believe, is around 1936 at the Fireman's Fair. Sometimes they even had 2 automobiles, not 1 but 2. And chances were 3 for a quarter. But don't forget, these cars sometimes only sold for $495. They weren't like the $20,000 or $21,000 cars today. Now, in that same year of 1936, the Globe Hotel in Red Bank on East Front Street was 96 years old, and it was one of the real landmarks of Red Bank. It had dated back there to 1840. Well, on December 19th of that year, in the early morning, the hotel took fire, and of course 2 people were rescued by Red Bank's aerial ladder. Matter of fact, most of you remember their American Le France, which was ordered in 1935. That truck was brand new at the time, and Fairhaven was among the various municipalities that were called to assist Red Bank in putting out this fire. Of course, the hotel was a total loss, that it had been torn down. And this is one of the first instances where a number of towns, including companies in Middletown and Shrewsbury, and perhaps as far south as Eatontown, were called to help Red Bank. Well, this is about the following year, and you see the pumper from 1936 in the middle, and you see the I believe it was an American Le France, or maybe it's a Brockway hook and ladder wagon to replace the earlier one. Matter of fact, Thomas Simmons is driving the hook and ladder wagon. Roy King has the pumper, and the ambulance, which was a Meteor ambulance. I believe was purchased secondhand, but it served very well. It was the second ambulance that the Fairhaven First Aid Squad had. And this is taken down outside Victory Park. jams here. Just pardon me a minute. What happened here?
There's probably a cookie.
Okay, this is supposed to be the fire alarms. Now let me see if I can get that to come into focus. Yes, this was around the late 1930s. This is what the various alarms were. Matter of fact, 35 was not, say, a general alarm. It was Grange Avenue, and I believe later 35 was down here at the corner of Baton Road and River Road. And basically those were those 8 alarms up top, and the several ones on the bottom were what were put out. And this was a card that you would put in your house, and so you'd know where the fire was. Now let me see if I can get the next one to come into place. All right, basically you see the side of it. Charlie Wesson in vaudeville was part of Wesson, Walters, and Wesson, and he was a child actor. And his family, of course, were vaudevillians going way back, and his uncle George Walters you saw in that earlier picture. Well, he lived in Fairhaven, and even after he no longer was a child actor, he became the fire chief in 1940. And of course he was one of the well-known people in Fairhaven. And Fairhaven, let me just see if I can get his wife. I think she's the next picture. I don't know why this is acting up like that. All right, well, Fairhaven, of course, from the time it became a borough, had rented jail space in the American Mechanics Hall. And as a matter of fact, when Fairhaven became a borough in April of 1912, they secured two cells in the back of the American Mechanics Hall. The cells were not really needed till August 1916. That's when they had their first occupant. Today, I suppose you wouldn't even have the paint dry on the walls of the cell any place, so you'd have people to put into it. And eventually, the Borough of Fairhaven bought the American Mechanics Hall as their first borough hall. The library was located in one half of the downstairs, and the borough clerk's office was in the other half. And you'll see the country store next door is now the back of Fairhaven Hardware. And where you drive into the back of the Borough Hall now today, that was the site of where the American Mechanics Hall had been. And you'll notice the Firehouse on the left, but by this time it has been fixed up as the Meyer Building, or more precisely it's Dr. Moran's office, but technically I guess its name is still the Meyer Building. And this is the back of those buildings around that time, just prior to the 1958, when the building had a small fire in its basement, and I guess the fact it was overcrowded and also it needed a lot of repair, and that's why it was torn down. Now, of course, when the fire company moved up to this present location, the fire tower had to be dismantled. And here's like the reverse of what you had seen in 1907. They're actually taking the tower down. And of course, this is the fire patrol truck that Paul McHugh now has. Well, going back for a minute to around 1907, here's a sleigh traveling west on River Road past the woods that were part of the Menon Estate. And originally, the Menon Estate was owned by a man named Stacy Pitcher, who operated steamboats from Red Bank to New York.
Packet boats.
In this aerial view of 1947, you'll see how sparsely settled Fairhaven was, and this clump of trees down here is where the firehouse is today. The other vacant land is where the Acme Shopping Center is. And of course, matter of fact, the little building on the corner, let me see if I can zero in on that, this one right here, was the forerunner of Ray Miller's gas station, and that was put up in 1946 or 47. But basically, you see how much vacant land was in Fairhaven at that time. This is a picture of the firehouse around 1966 during the fair season, during the week of the fair, and I believe it's August 27th to September 8th. Would that be right? It's a little bit dates are a little bit blurry, but anyway, that's what the sign says. And of course, the most spectacular fire in Fairhaven's history, and I think those of you who probably lived through it would remember it quite well, was the fire at the Fairhaven Yacht Works, where, well, their estimated loss was well over $1 million. And of course, the fact that it was a very dangerous fire, I guess maybe the fact that it was fought in daytime and it was winter time, I don't know if that made any difference, but a lot of boats were in storage. I believe propane tanks and gasoline tanks, other types of tanks with explosives exploded, and of course the place was more or less a total loss. Now, coming to the present, again on a happier note, most of you know what's been going on recently. You've had different things, and coming up now is Memorial Day. And I might just mention this, these pictures I took about 2 years ago on Memorial Day, and this is your wreath laying ceremony outside the firehouse, and that was where Frank Leslie was ringing the bell, I believe. I think he'll remember that. And also, it just goes to show you how time passes, and here's a man that we all knew very well, Bert Roundtree, conducting traffic, and I'm sorry to say he's no longer with us. But anyway, this Memorial Day weekend, as you possibly know, there's the improved monument, the additions to the monument to honor veterans of all the wars and all the deceased veterans, and also there's Pride in Fairhaven weekend. And if I put you through enough punishment tonight and you don't want to come to Norwood School on Monday, May 31st at 12:30 to see some more history of Fairhaven, well then don't come. But if you do want to see some more, please come and be our guest. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer some. And thank you for your patience. Anybody have questions?